Okay, looks like we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie, and we at Standing for Truth are dedicated to defending the truth of biblical creation. We also host debates, interviews, lectures, and more. And so if you enjoy this content, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. And please share around this content as the truth is so incredibly important. One of the many ways we defend the truth of biblical creation here on Standing for Truth Ministries is by inviting and hosting some awesome guests on the program. And today we have a very important program with two very awesome guests. We are here for day one of our two-day event titled Flood Boundaries. And it is a privilege to have both John Mackay, the creation guy, and Joseph Hubbard here with me for this epic event. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here and giving us your time for tonight's important event.
It's good to be here.
See you again from tomorrow, mate. It's already tomorrow over here, so we're ahead.
That's true. You guys are in the future, so I appreciate you, coming and visiting us in the past. So I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, I'm in the future too, but not quite as much as John. So it's sort of late night here, as it always seems to be when we meet. But Lord willing, we'll keep going, and He'll give me strength.
We got a mix of all the time zones here, and I'm excited for this. And for the audience sake, I do want to go over a couple details in terms of what we are dealing with here over the course of the next couple days. And in this two-day event, we will be focusing on some very exciting topics. And these topics include history and theory of sedimentation, sediment formation, and the boundaries of the flood, pre, the flood itself, and post. And as always, we will be making this two-day event interactive with the audience. We want to get you guys involved. So please make sure you're tagging me with your questions at Standing for Truth, and that way I won't miss them. Okay, let's get right into the fun. I'm going to hand the floor over to our awesome guests here tonight, John Mackay and Joe Hubbard. Gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to kick off the proceedings, and then we're going to bring John in for a little bit of a chat back and forth. And then I'm going to take the first session, and we're going to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers, Q&As. Let's see if I can share my screen here and make sure everything is all good. There we go. Lovely job. Hopefully you can see that up on the screen now.
Yes, looks good, Joe.
Great stuff. Perfect. All right. So you can see we have a brand new logo since we were last on as well. This is courtesy of Sam Jenkins, who is a regular on our creation conversations. He's come on board to keep an eye on things and look after us, especially the technological side of stuff. It looks pretty good. What have we been up to? Well, this is one of the things we've been organising since we last spoke. We're holding... Well, John held a similar kind of thing to this a few years back, or it had to be over 10 years back now, John, when you came down to the Isle of Wight and you held a convention of sorts, but it was focused around fossil hunting. Well, I thought it's high time we did it again, and we're sort of upping the game here. We have hired out the entire of our base camp area at Monkton Wild Holiday Park. You will come along, you will camp for the 5 nights, the 6 days. Every day we will have morning devotions and an overview. We go down on the beach, we dig up fossils, we come back, we have workshops, and we use the stuff that we've learned on the field trips, we've learned from the fossils in the workshops, and really see what evidence we can find. And then in the evening, we will have seminars featuring myself, John, Dr. Diane Eager, and a whole number of other people that we're getting to come on board from all around the world and the UK, specialists and scientists, to come and do a series of seminars in the evening. So it promises to be a brilliant fossil convention, camping fossil convention, one of a kind. 26th of September to the 1st of October is the dates. You can find out all the information online, and you can even save some money by booking if you're in the UK or can get to the UK, or you want to come on a unique camping fossil hunting convention. You can find out all the details at the creationresearchstore.com or the Creation Research Centre. We've also started another broadcast. You will know, if you know anything about what we do sort of online, we have our weekly broadcast Creation Conversations, which also goes out as a podcast courtesy of Sam Jenkins. And we've started doing a Creation Research Evidence News broadcast. Basically, for many, many years now, Creation Research has been putting out Creation Research Evidence News. It's free. You can sign up to it on our website. It deals with news from creation research, but also news in the real world. A news item on the BBC or Sky News or Science Direct or whatever it is, how does that fit into a biblical worldview? Is it really evidence for evolution? Is it evidence for creation? How can we interpret it? And so that goes out for free. Make sure you sign up to it. It keeps you up to date with what we're doing as well. But Diane Eager, Dr. Diane Eager, she looks after all this kind of evidence research news stuff. So we started doing a broadcast when the evidence news comes out. We record several sessions with her. We've just finished one tonight. We broadcast it, or rather recorded it, just a couple of hours ago. So that'll be ready to go out very shortly on the Creation Research News channel. It's something a little bit different, and it gives you a little bit more information than you would get just in the Evidence News broadcast. So make sure you're signed up to that. Make sure you're watching the broadcast. We've got some fabulous new fossils in as well. Here's one that was donated not too long back, a brilliant set of dinosaur eggs. Yes, people love dinosaurs, and these will be down at the convention for you to come and see, all part of our Creation Research Museums project, including this brand new acquisition of a giant mosasaur skull. You see the eye there and the teeth and the jaw, which has been squashed around the other side of the snout. I mean, this has been buried very quickly, and it's been buried under pressure. There's no doubt about it. Mosasaurus, named after the River Meuse in Belgium, where it was first discovered. So you don't need to be scared of big, long, technical Latin words. We use Latin because it's a dead language and everybody around the world can understand it, but they usually just mean some very simple stuff. A wonderful, great big mosasaur sea dragon skull in our museum collection. All right, here's our topic tonight, the boundaries of the flood, title courtesy of Sam Jenkins. Now, in order to really get to grips with this, we've got to deal with a whole load of different stuff, including history, including fossils, including strata. Can we even get to a point of saying, here's the line, which is everything below is the flood, everything above is post-flood? So I'm going to pause here for a minute. I'm going to bring John back on, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat backwards and forward. So let me bring my browser back up and stop screen sharing. And John, over to you, because I believe you have a few little fossils to talk about.
I do, but that's sort of like to introduce where you're coming from. So first of all, I better slip in a commercial in case we have any Australian viewers. I know George is out shopping or something today, so he's one of our regulars here and a helper on the program. But we are also running a camp, a bush camp, a bush Easter. Right now, you may never have heard of such a thing, probably only possible in Australia. You even, like the turtle and the tortoise, have to bring your own house. You camp, you bring your caravan, you can even sleep on the ground if you're brave enough, because I've been west of Bendigo where this camp's going to happen, and it can snow even in the middle of summer or as early as autumn. So if you want more details of that, go to creationresearch.net, and the whole Easter program convention, great topics, great Bible teaching. And as usual, the hosts, who I've known for many, many years, said, can we do a field trip? So yes, even at Easter, we are going to do a field trip on the Monday afternoon, and you'll get some fabulous fossils on the old gold fields. You might be like that young girl who came on one of our field trips a few years ago, and she brought home some gold. By the way, Easter, really, the convention is all about the real gold, the real valuable stuff, who is Christ as creator and savior. So that's my bit of a commercial. So go to our website, find out where it is, when it's on, if you're in Victoria. And at last, we're starting to get some open borders in Australia. So that's really good news. Okay, Joseph's right. I did bring some shells in. They primarily illustrate both what Joseph's doing and more of what's coming tomorrow, because today Joseph's going to deal with a little bit of history, and he's going to then, we're going to take questions, and then my part will be to deal with layers. Okay, so if you think of the fossils that I've got here, there is a fossil shell. Yes, it just looks like an ordinary shell. It's well preserved, but it's called an Arca shell. Now, we know these Arca shells. We've known them for thousands of years. And you even find out that Aristotle, ancient Greek, 300 or so BC, he believed because you found shells up on the tops of mountains, shells don't live on the tops of mountains. So therefore, these were actually tricks. They weren't real shells. They were imitation shells made by the gods, made by plastic forces in the earth. They were deceitful things. Okay, now it's interesting because 500 years later, Tertullian, a Christian leader, he said, no, the shells up on the mountains are evidence that Noah's flood is real. What a contrast. Pagan view, old earth. Yes, Aristotle was an old earth person, and no evolution of the sort that Darwin was in, but definitely a form of evolution, and the fossils were jokes, tricks. And then you get Tertullian, who says, okay, God's told us you can trust the world because you can trust him. If it looks like a shell, well, you think of his conclusion. He said it's evidence for Noah's flood. Now, our theme today will be following through the history of thinking, and Tertullian, no doubt about it, like me, could pick up his Bible and find even in the Psalms, Psalm 29, that it finishes this way: the God who is the king, who sits as Lord of the flood forever. And that's the only place outside of Genesis where the Hebrew word for Noah's flood is used. God as king and Lord sits over the flood forever. And that's why it finishes in that very encouraging verse, God can give peace to his people. A great reminder in a world where you've got Ukraine and Russia and turmoil all over the place. So Noah's flood, creation, peace, enmity, all of these things are all actually related. It's not just an abstract subject. Okay, you get to 500 AD, and I was amazed as I was reading the life history of the Mongols. And of course, they went to China and they recorded all sorts of interesting things. You get the Italian guy who went over there, Marco Polo. He recorded liquid that burned, oil. And of course, what you find is in 500, there's a few Chinese people who report fishes. And you go up the mountain and collect them. They smell like dead fish. What do you do with that? Well, the Chinese, of course, they weren't the same as the ancient Greeks, and neither were they Christians. So it just disappears into oblivion until people like the Mongols come and say, look what they've got, fish that are smelly and fish that burn. Interesting. Okay, now let's jump forward up to the 1500s, the Reformation, and you find somebody mentions petrified wood. Come on, guess who? You know, it absolutely surprised me because the name of the guy was Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther, sort of key in the Reformation, but he knew all about fossil trees because his father worked in a coal mine. He went to the coal mine and his logic was God can be trusted. He stamped his nature on creation. If it looks like a tree, it's probably it. But you know where I read that? I was reading through Martin Luther's commentary. And Martin Luther has got the great benefit, the privilege of being one of the first whose ideas were spread far and wide. The Chinese weren't. The ancient Greeks really weren't. That Martin Luther was because of the invention of the printing press. Skip forward a couple of hundred years and you find this. Oh, you see, when we're talking about the bottom of the geologic column, or should we be using that word? How would you recognize where the sediments started, where they finished? In many people's minds, the Trilobite forms, 1, 2, 3. Old Walk, he actually invented that name. It's got 3 lobes, almost in both directions, but he used the ones going across. Tri, 3, lobe, as in your earlobe, and bite, as in ITE, meaning thing, a 3-lobe thing. And he didn't regard it as millions of years old, neither did he regard it as the bottom of the geologic column, because that was still to come. In fact, by the time you get to not far from where Joseph has done some digging, and I have too, right up the east coast of England, you find some black shale. You see the shiny black stuff in the middle? That's coal. In fact, Durham was famous for coal. And in fact, when we look at the geologic column, you find words like carboniferous. But even that existed before the concept of the geological column. And the man who invented the word carboniferous was the Reverend Conybeare. Now, surprisingly, you find a huge impact of Christians from Tertullian all the way through to the Reverend Connie Bear, who are tied up in geology. Carboniferous? No, not millions of years, not the theory of evolution. It's simply full of black carbon, in this case, coal. Oh, and of course, can I encourage you, take a visit to Durham sometime, read the town signboard on the website, and you find they are very proud of one thing. Their bishop in the 1200s, he had a problem to solve. And Joseph's going to take this up as he deals with history. And number one, here was his problem. Theologians, Theol, meaning God, logons, as in logic or logos, the people who had a word about God. Theo, logos, a God word. Well, he knew all about theology, but you see, he lived in an area where we dug up rocks eventually, where we used the coal. We need a new word, he said, the study of the rocks. God has told us about the study of himself. Now, what do we call the study of rocks? So he invented the concept, and there it is, proudly boasted about on the town website. Go to their web, check it out yourself. He's the inventor of the concept of geology, and it was a Christian bishop. Now, you wouldn't think that if you read through your geological books on the millions of years of layers, etc. I mean, let me start. Here's my last sample for this morning. Can you see this? Can you see the layers in it? Now, you and I call those strata. This is supposed to be nearly 1,000 million years old. And can you see the fossil in the top? Now, that's a fossil stromatolite. The funny thing is, stromatolite simply means layered thing. And it's in a rock full of layer, but we use the Greek and Latin words, it means the same. We call the other one strata. Strata, stroma, layered things. And they use millions of years these days, and no relationship to God at all. So in our subject, as we go through today, dealing with the history of things, as we look at me on how do layers form anyway, as we go to tomorrow and deal with the geologic column in depth, beginning, end, does it even have such a thing? How does it really form overall? And you've got the opportunity 3 times, I believe, to answer questions, to ask questions, really. I think you'll have a wonderful time. Joseph, how about you take it from there and give us a bit of history?
Absolutely. A little bit of a disclaimer, right? And I love all of you people over in the States, but as we were talking just before we went live, when you sort of, withdrew yourself from the British Empire, you kind of not only threw out the concept of kings and queens and cups of tea and all that kind of stuff, you also seem to throw out a lot of history. So one of the things that we have to do, unfortunately, is go and have a full look through history. Oh, the whole story, the winners write the history. Well, it is true, but sometimes you need to actually go outside the box, get a full perspective. Now, what does history have to do with the boundaries of the flood? Well, you see, one of the big discussions you'll find amongst geologists who are proponents of Noah's flood, and some of the criticisms you'll find from geologists who are critics of Noah's flood, is this idea of, well, where on the geological column can you get a big black marker and go, there's the boundary. Everything below is the flood rocks. Everything above is the post-flood rocks. And can you get a big black marker and go, everything below this is the pre-flood created rocks, and everything in between is the flood rocks? I mean, what are we even talking about when we talk about the geological column? So we need to delve a little bit into history, and we need to have a little bit of a look at how these concepts and how these ideas came about. Now, it's a fascinating journey, so hold on to your hats. We're going to go through a lot of history, but it really is important in order to actually make sure we get a full perspective. So I'm going to bring my slides back up. Hopefully you can all see that still. Whoops.
Looks good, Joe.
There. That's good. Lovely job. All right. Here is your standard geological model. This is a diagram taken straight out of my university geology book, which I did several years back now. You can see you've got your main groupings on the far left-hand side: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. Then you've got all the kind of words that perhaps you're familiar with. I mean, Jurassic's in there, Cretaceous, Permian, Pennsylvanian and Mississippian. Oh, Pennsylvanian and Mississippian. I mean, you in America, you'll recognize some of these words, right? We didn't call it that. We named it first, and we grouped them both together and called them Upper and Lower Carboniferous. Carboniferous, because it was full of carbon. That's where you get your coal from. And of course, the Americans couldn't go with the British naming, and so they named them Pennsylvanian and Mississippian. We get quite a lot of the words in here linked back to our country, names like Ordovician and Cambrian and Devonian and so on and so forth. They all have to do with different places or different tribes or different parts of history in Britain. I mean, it's really fascinating when you start to delve down into words and the history of words, and you start to see how interconnected everything is. That's kind of what we're going to try and do today. So here's your geological column, and then of course we get the question, well, where is the flood post-flood boundary? Is it down near the Permian or the Triassic? I mean, that's one suggestion. Is it at the Permo-Triassic? Is it at the Mesozoic or the Cenozoic, so the KT boundary? I mean, that's when the big asteroid was supposed to have killed off all the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Was it at the Tertiary or the Quaternary? You know, right up high. Quaternary to present. Where are the boundaries? Where is the rocks that were formed in the flood? Where are the rocks that were formed after the flood? And where's the rocks that were formed on day 3 of creation? How can we try and fit it into this kind of geologic column? Now, for many years, one of the things that creationists have done is they've seen, well, all right, we've got lots and lots of millions of years along the right-hand side there. Let's just get rid of the millions of years, ignore the millions of years, and let's get this entire geological column and fit it within a year of the flood. Now, really, it doesn't work like that. And that's not because I'm saying that the rocks on Earth couldn't have been produced in a flood. What I'm saying is there's a very serious issue with the geological column and the way that it's put together in the first place. And this is some of the stuff that we're going to go into over the next 2 days. A better question to ask, rather than where's the boundary, is this model actually reliable in the first place? Okay, Derek Ager. In a book called The New Catastrophism. I actually have a copy of the book here. It's out of print now, but you can still pick it up on eBay and places like that. I know John's got a copy. I know we've got a copy in the office in the States as well, because I saw it over there in your little cubby hole, John, at the Carmen's place. And it's quite a fascinating book to read, because Derek Ager, well, this is a second edition, and he actually starts his introduction by saying creationists are not allowed to use this. I mean, it's right here. I think it necessary to include the following disclaimer. In the view of the misuse that my words have been put to in the past, I wish to say nothing in this book should be taken out of context and thought in any way to support the views of creationists who I refuse to call scientific. So he certainly wasn't a friend of our model, of creation, of the Bible. But he did have some rather scathing reviews of the geological column and the standard assumptions that had been in geology for so many years. Have a look at what he says here. Nowhere in the world is the record or even part of it anywhere near complete. He's talking about the geologic record. He's talking about the geological column. Even in the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River and the adjacent sections along the Little Colorado River, surely the finest record of geological history anywhere on Earth, there are huge breaks. There are huge gaps. Well, okay, let's move one step further. Is this really a good model? But where did this model come from in the first place? And this is when we really need to dig back through the history books. We need to ask, how was this model developed? And we've also got to ask, was this model developed with a global flood in mind? You see, a popular belief out there today, even amongst some creationists, is that the idea of a very old Earth is a modern scientific idea. With the Enlightenment in the 1700s, more people started thinking about this, and slowly over time, as evidence began to be collected, they realized that the Earth was very, very old indeed. It's a popular belief out there, certainly amongst the proponents of an old Earth, and even amongst some creationists, people think this. The issue? Science and Creationists, National Academy of Sciences. Scientists knew that the Earth was old before they knew how old. Now, what a ridiculous statement. Scientists knew that the Earth was old before they knew how old. I mean, knew? How can you know something is old if you don't know how old or have no way to quantify it? I mean, scientists probably suspected that the Earth was old. Scientists wanted the Earth to be old, but before they knew how old. What this actually does is shows you the underlying issue. There is a philosophy here which comes before the evidence. That's what we're looking at today. All right, let's throw some Bible verses in there. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 9 to 11. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. And there is nothing new under the sun. Ah, you wonder where that phrase come from? It's right out of the Bible. There is nothing new under the sun. No, the idea of an old earth is not a new one. The idea of an old earth, as we will see as we go forward, is based on a rejection of scripture. It's based on a false pagan philosophy, which can be dated right back to the Sumerians, into antiquity. Let's carry on through the Bible verse. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. This is why studying history is so important, whether you're dealing with any kind of topic within Christianity or science or geology or, the philosophies. You need to understand your history. You need to understand where people have gone before, because, well, today nobody really remembers it. I mean, it's bad enough here in the UK, and we have a wonderfully rich history of several thousand years, and yet so little people know much about it. I mean, most people think, Romans came, Henry VIII, and then history really started with World War II and the Beatles. And I'm afraid to say it's even worse in the States. Of course, there's a little connection here that you can see between Ecclesiastes and 2 Peter. There shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust, saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they are willingly ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. The former generations have forgotten. The modern generation has forgotten what the former generations were taught. They've forgotten what happened. We need to make sure we get a full history perspective. So, our program today, I'm going to be dealing with the history of geology in the geologic column. We'll have a break for questions and answers. John will come back and take us to our next step, our next logical step, which is the strata machines and having a look at Steno's principles that I'll introduce. And then on day 2, we're going to really get into this geological column. And finally, we're going to round up by recognizing rocks from a global flood to see if we can actually get anywhere with determining the boundaries of the flood. Remember, questions and answers throughout. We're going to try and keep the questions that we answer on the topic that we're dealing with tonight. If not, we could be here for hours on end. But make sure you also check out our Q&A site, askjohnmackay.com. If your question doesn't get answered, or if you particularly want it answered, send it to us and we'll probably be able to feature it on one of our creation conversations. Fossil and geology history. It goes back a lot further than you think. The key phrase is the present is the key to the past. Who said it? We'll come on to that. Our first section, deep time and antiquity, from the Sumerians to the Babylonians to the Hindus. Introducing the Sumerian king list. Now, the Sumerians were a civilization that lived in sort of the Middle East. Around was their central bit. You've probably heard of That's where God called Abram out of before he was Abraham. It seems to be one of the first civilizations to have risen up after the Tower of Babel, somewhere around where the Tower of Babel was, so it's not surprising. And they had a Sumerian king list. Now, there's plenty of documentation on the Sumerian king list, and we can't go through it all. If you want a really good book, The Authenticity of the Book of Genesis by Dr. Bill Cooper. Really detailed, goes in depth into the Sumerian king list, and it also talks about the correlation that the Sumerian kings list has between the 8 pre-flood kings and the 8 pre-flood patriarchs of Genesis. Yes, there's definitely a correlation in the beliefs of the Sumerians and the Mosaic beliefs that were documented in the book of Genesis. However, one major exception is the exaggerated ages. Now, the 8 pre-flood kings, according to the Sumerian king list, were said to have reigned a total of 241,200 years between creation and the flood. Yes, the Sumerians believed in a creation event, very similar to the biblical account of the creation event. They believed in a literal and worldwide flood, very similar to the account of the biblical worldwide flood, but there was a discrepancy. They had exaggerated the ages from just a couple of thousand years to 241,000 100,000 years. Note, texts such as the Sumerian King List and the Epic of Gilgamesh show that these accounts of creation and the Noah's flood were accepted as real historical events. There was no doubt in their minds these were real events, but they'd been corrupted over time, most likely to claim sovereignty over other nations. It's an issue of national pride. We'll slip a little bit of exaggeration in there to prove that we are the most important. Why? Because if we've been here for 200,000 years longer than you have, we must be far more important than you. Yes, the issue of racism is not a new one. It goes right back to the Sumerians and even further. But you find it's the first ever reference to an exaggeration of time out of scripture. They accepted the biblical events as real, but they exaggerated them to fit a purpose. Skip forward in time and you find Barossas the Chaldean. Now, Barossas was a Hellenistic era, that means sort of just early Greek. He was a Babylonian chief priest of Baal Marduk. Baal Marduk, yes, connected to Baal out of, the Bible, the god of the Philistines. All these chief gods seem to be connected around the Middle East. He was the chief god. He was the one that the food was being sacrificed to, that Daniel refused to eat in the book of Daniel. And this guy, Barossas, was the chief priest. Lived around 300 years BC. He controlled the Babylonian archives and the history libraries. Yes, you heard me right. The Babylonians had libraries containing a history section. This is the ancient Babylonians, by the way, and that always blows my mind. You can go back even further. The ancient Assyrians had a special section in their library dedicated to ancient history. The ancients having it's amazing when you learn your history that you can find. But Barossas was determined to make Babylonians the most ancient of all civilizations and therefore the most important. So what did he do? Well, in his book Babylonica, which was a history of Babylonia, Barossas claimed an additional 1,680,000 years occurred prior to the Sumerian King List. He argued that between the flood to Alexander the Great was 36,000 years. He predicted a further 12,000 years of human history would occur, bringing the total cosmos history to 2,160,000 years, which you will find is a multiple of 60. It's a multiple of 600 Soros, which is the Babylonian way of thinking. They followed a sexagesimal philosophy, multiples of 60. And so everything was wrapped up in a nice little tight logical ball of a total cosmos history of over 2 million years. This is millions of years long before Darwin. This is millions of years long before any kind of modern philosophical thinking that we would recognize as modern science. This is millions of years straight out of the ancients. And are you noticing the succession? Real account of history, scripture, the Mosaic account, exaggerated by the Sumerians, and they certainly believed these were real events, but they exaggerated to make themselves better. The Babylonians under Barossas exaggerated it even further to not only make themselves the most important, but also to fit their philosophy. The Babylonians had great influence on the Hindus and the birth of the Hindu religion. Hindu cosmology has been greatly affected by the Sumerian and Babylonian theology and philosophy. You can see that in the simple fact that cows are sacred in India. Why are cows sacred in India? It goes back to the cow god Baal. Interesting connection. They adopted this pagan sexagesimal system, but they extended the history from millions to billions of years. Again, long before Darwin, long before any modern philosophy, and it's interesting to see just how close the modern idea of the age of the universe is to the god Brahma and the single day of the god Brahma. You see, they incorporated a rather bleak regeneration philosophy of the world has been going on and on and on, and you get rebirthed. They followed a philosophy which could be recognized today as the Lyell philosophy of present is the key to the past. They believed that the cosmos was the god Brahma. He had a lifespan. A single day in his life was roughly 15 billion years, and his total lifespan was 311 and 40 billion years. So that's about 3.11 trillion years, something like that. So we've extended cosmology to now the billions or even the trillions of years. Again, long before Darwin or any modern philosophy of deep time, Alexander the Great heavily influenced Mesopotamia and India. Alexander the Great came from a Greek background, and you can see the influence of the Greeks in India even today. I mean, you can be walking through, a Hindu temple in northern India, in northwest India, and you can be passing statues of Buddha and all sorts of stuff, and then suddenly you'll find a Gandhara statue of Atlas. Atlas, one of the Greek gods, they're next to a Buddhist god, or they're next to one of the Hindu gods. Interesting. And also you'll find that it was Alexander the Great that introduced the caste system into India. You know, the bottom all the way up to the top in terms of importance of people. And you'll find that even today, the most popular beauty product in India is face whitening cream. Because according to the caste system, white man is at the top. That's something that the British Empire certainly, took advantage of, but it wasn't introduced by them. It was introduced by Alexander the Great. I'm the most important, I'm the most powerful, and I'm the part of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, so you listen to what I say. But not only did Alexander the Great influence India, India heavily influenced Alexander the Great, both in the terms of its philosophy, in the religion, and the acceptance of deep time, the acceptance of millions of years. Move on to Greek philosophy, heavily affected by both Babylonian and Hindu philosophy, and Hindu philosophy affected by Babylonian philosophy as well. So you've got it sort of double jointed there, and you can see this in their pagan system. But towards the end of the Greeks, they began to reject a theological position of many, many gods, and they started to adopt a naturalistic philosophy based off of the concepts that they'd taken from Middle Eastern ideology. What are we talking about? Well, here's some of their ideas. Things like Plato and several of the other Greek philosophers proposed the idea of an early primordial soup philosophy to explain the naturalistic origin of life. They believed in spontaneous generation, that life could just arise given the right conditions. They also believed in a version of natural selection. Although they didn't call it that, you can see the extremely stark similarities in their natural selection philosophy based on the natural arising of hopeful creatures. And these hopeful creatures may be able to survive better than the less hopeful creatures, and they could give rise to the next generation of hopeful creatures. You see the similarity in the Darwinian theory of natural selection? Interesting. And it went even further than that. They believed that they were the most important race on the planet. Yeah, not only did they believe in a version of what we would recognize today as evolution, it was a very racist version of evolution, because they believed that they'd evolved out of the slime. But they believed that they'd evolved out of better quality slime than the Jews had, or the Africans had. Racism, it's not a new idea. It wasn't introduced by Darwin. It's right back to the Greek philosophy. All right. Important dates. Let's move forward a bit. You've seen the birth of this millions of years ideology right back in the pagan antiquities, and it really has nothing to do with science or evidence. It has everything to do with trying to prove that you're the best people, right? It has everything to do with exaggerating or interpreting the evidence or interpreting history to fit your own philosophy. But let's get another ancient set of thinking here. I mean, AD 115, we're only talking about 200 to 300 years after the Greeks, right? Theophilus of Antioch. Creation occurred, he says, between 5529 BC, give or minus 200 years. Well, that's a stark difference to what the Greeks were proposing. That's a very stark difference from what the Hindus were proposing. Where did he get this idea from? The answer is straight out of the scripture. But look at what he was quoting. He says, according to the Bible, creation occurred at 5529 BC, give or take 200 years, not the tens of thousands as Plato, etc. have written. He's quoting the Greeks. He knows what the Greeks were promoting. He even knows where the Greeks got their ideas from, and he's saying, no, we need to get back to scripture here. Another one of the church fathers, 240 AD. Look at what he said. Plato and many of the other philosophers, they perhaps followed the Chaldeans. Chaldeans, Barossas the Chaldean, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. You see, even they saw that it went back further than the Greeks, who, as Cicero has related in his first book, Respecting Divination, foolishly say that they possess comprised in their memorials 470,000 years. Even he knew that it was wrong. Foolishly saying, he says. But we, whom the Holy Scriptures instruct to the knowledge of the truth, know the beginning and the end of the world. Therefore, let the philosophers who think up these thousands of years of ages from the beginning of the world know that the 6,000th year is not yet completed. Stark difference to what the Greeks and the Hindus were promoting, and all the way back to the Chaldeans. Interesting. But it's the fact that they recognize that this was a philosophy which was being brought up by the Greeks of millions of years in deep time, long before anything else came from Darwin. Augustine, 350 AD, in the City of God book. Let us then omit the conjectures of men, who know not what they say when they speak of the origin and the nature of the human race. They are deceived too by those highly mendacious documents which profess to give a history or many thousand years, though through reckoning the sacred writings we find that not 6,000 years has yet passed. You have a conflict of philosophies, one based on scripture, and these are the early church fathers, right? They recognized that the earth was young, certainly compared to what Plato and the Chaldeans, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Greeks were promoting. All right. You then have a sort of a clash, if you like, from the early church fathers and the influence of Christianity through the Roman Catholic religion into the sort of European, and you kind of have this weird mix of, yes, we believe the Bible, but we're also allowing the Romans to influence us, and the Romans were heavily influenced by the Greeks, so we really believe that fossils are just natural. We kind of believe in Noah's flood, but we believe that really maybe it didn't do very much. We believe maybe Noah's flood did do a lot, but it didn't form the fossils, because what are fossils? I mean, fossils comes from the old Latin to be dug up, although there's even discussion today as to what that means, because again, no history is taught. But let's introduce Dino for a moment, and I'm going to hold up some fossils to show you. You see, Nicholas Dino, you can see him there in his monk outfit. He was a believer in Genesis and Noah's flood, but he was also the founder of paleontology and stratigraphy. What is his background? Well, I have some fossils here, so hopefully Donnie can put me up on full screen while I hold these fossils up to you. Can you tell what this is? Hey, it's a very large shark tooth. This is one of the famous meg shark teeth. And
we can't see you, Joseph. We can't see you.
You can't see me at all. Okay, let me see if I can. I might have to stop screen sharing.
There we are.
I got it, Joe.
Is that good? Right, I'll leave it like that then.
There you go, brother.
There we go. Let's hold that back up to the camera again. Let's see if we can get it into focus if we hold it in front of my face so he doesn't see me. Never mind. Hand back there.
That's good.
Yeah, that's roughly in focus. There we go. This is the shark tooth that I was talking about. It's one of the giant megalodon shark teeth. I mean, it looks pretty spectacular. It's rather enormous. It's featured in a film, a scary film like Jaws. It's a great big shark's tooth. Now, okay, you and I look at this and we both instantly recognize that this is a shark tooth, albeit a very, very large one. But you realize to the ancient Greeks, that was an ridiculous idea. I mean, let me just show you another one of my fossils here. It's also a shark tooth, and you'll be able to recognize it straight away. It's a rather brilliant shark tooth. It's a bit smaller, but do you see how it's encased in rock? You see, the Greeks dug up these teeth as well, and they said, well, hang on a minute, sharks live in the water. They don't live in the rocks. Therefore, these must be tricks played on us by the gods. Interesting. It was a trick played by the gods. Nothing to do with what it actually looks like. I mean, it can't possibly be a shark tooth. It's in the rock, right? Sharks come in the water. And the ancient Greeks concluded, based on their pagan philosophy system, that these sharks' teeth were just tricks played by the gods. And the Greeks influenced the Romans, and the Romans influenced Christianity, and Roman Catholic religion that spread through Christianity taught that these were tricks played on, well, not by the Greek gods at this point, but played on by Satan. The devil put these in the rocks, nothing to do with anything real. Interesting how far the whole sort of philosophy of science and exploring and experimentation had actually fallen. All right, let's bring up my PowerPoint slides again and bring up Nicholas Dino here. Oh, if it works. There we go. Nicholas Dino was a revolutionary thinker. What did he do? He studied shark teeth. You see some of his diagrams from his publication there. A great big shark jaw. You see, this was one that was actually caught out in the Mediterranean. And it was brought into Steno, and he saw the teeth of the shark, and he said, hang on a minute, these look exactly like the tongue stones. Oh, tongue stones? That was the name the Greeks had given these shark teeth that you dig out of the rocks. And Nicholas Steno said, well, hang on a minute, let's actually start to build some principles here. And so in his book, a huge, great big book on all about how, hey, if it looks like a shark tooth and it seems like a shark's tooth, it probably is a shark's tooth. Look at what he said. If a solid substance is in every other way like another solid substance, not only as regards to the conditions of the surface, but also as regards to the inner arrangement of the parts and the particles, it will also be like it as regards the manner and place of production. In other words, what Steno's saying is if it looks like a shark tooth both outside and inside, then it probably is a shark tooth, right? Logic to you, logic to me. But then we think critically today. Revolutionary to the Greeks and revolutionary at the time of Steno in the mid-1600s. How did Steno get to this philosophy? Well, it was quite simple. He believed in the Bible. He believed that God wouldn't play tricks on us or allow tricks to be played on us like this. He believed that if it was created, then it could be trusted. And so he said, well, hang on a minute, if it looks like a shark tooth and you cut it open and it has every single detail of a shark tooth, both inside and out, including all of the enamel and bone and everything, then you can safely conclude it is a shark's tooth. And now you can ask the very legitimate question, how did this shark tooth get in the rocks? And now you're asking the right questions, you start a new branch of science, paleontology. Something we like to remind people at Creation Research is unless you ask the right questions, you'll never get the right answers. All right, Nicholas Steno, believer in the Bible, the founder of paleontology and sedimentology. Hey, sedimentology has something to do with what we're talking about tonight. You see, he started, or founded rather, the principle of superposition. Principle of superposition, the bottom layer formed first. Strata, layers, are laid down horizontally. Here you can see a load of layers. You can see lots of different fossils in the layers. Steno argued during Noah's flood, you had a big churn up of sediments and the bottom settled first, then the next layer, then the next layer, then the next layer from bottom to top. This was his principle. This was his argument. You see, Steno's rock layer principle was simple. The bottom rocks got there first, the top rocks got there last. Therefore, the bottom rocks were perhaps the oldest, the top rocks were the youngest. Although Steno never actually went that far. He never started assigning ages to the rocks. He just said the bottom rocks got there first, the top rocks got there last. But following that logic, you have the bottom rocks as the oldest, the top rocks as the youngest. Okay, I'll ask a question. Fish A and fish B. Now fossils, buried in the rock layers. According to Steno's principle of superposition, which fish was buried first, fish A or fish B? Well, if the bottom layer was formed first and the top layer was formed last, then fish B was buried first, according to Steno's principle. But as we go on, and as John comes in just a moment, you're going to see that there's perhaps a little bit of a problem with this when you try and match this principle with the real world. Let's move on through history. A return to the Greek, the French revolutionary thinkers. You see, the French Revolution, the French Revolution happened and you ended up with what? A lot of dead French people. I mean, the Russian Revolution ended up with pretty much the same result. Britain had a revolution too. We had an industrial revolution, which didn't end up with quite as many dead people, but there were certainly lots of issues around that as well. But the French revolutionary thinkers had an issue. They needed an excuse to get rid of the kings and the queens. They wanted to get rid of the monarchy. I do hope you Americans realize how strong a connection you have between your independence and the French. It goes right back. And it really is interesting. It actually goes back to the pagan origins. Why? Well, you see, the French hate the English and the English hate the French, unless, of course, somebody attacks us and we help each other. It's, we'll fight amongst ourselves. But the French needed an excuse to get rid of the monarchs. Now, back then, the monarchy was believed to have been appointed by God. So to question the monarchy was to question God. The French still had a predominantly Roman Catholic philosophy. But of course, what's the solution? Get rid of God. If there's no God, then there's no God-appointed monarchy, and so we can chop the king's head off. Yay! All right, so what did they do? They took inspiration from the Greeks' naturalistic philosophies. By the way, this is well documented, and you can pick up many different books on this matter. Here's one that's out of print currently, but you can pick it up here and there. From the Greeks to Darwin, an outline of the development of the evolution idea. Yeah, there's no denying it. It's well documented through history, although you'll never find this in a modern biology textbook today. You can easily trace the Greeks all the way down through the French revolutionaries and into modern scientific thinking. What do? People like de Maillet, Buffon, Voltaire, they all started accepting the Greek naturalistic philosophy of life arising naturally, of spontaneous generation, of hopeful creatures and natural selection. They argued that fossils were inorganic or fake. They rejected Steno's ideas. They argued that a flood was impossible, or if there was Noah's flood, it was so gentle and quiet that it didn't do any damage. They argued the Earth could have been at least 2 billion years old, and that life just arises naturally through spontaneous generation. Now, if the French go somewhere and the French hate the English, you'll be certain that the Scots will follow the French, because the Scots also hate the English, right? And you'll find the first introduction to this resurgence of Greek pagan philosophy came from a Scotsman, James Hutton, who promoted the thinking of uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. Note well, up to this point, not a single one of these philosophies has been based off of observation or science. It's been based off of a rejection of biblical authority based on a pagan philosophy, which started out with I want to be better than you, so I'm going to exaggerate the truth in order to make myself seem better and more powerful. Then you introduce figures like Ray and Hooke. They were doubters of the Genesis flood, again influenced by the earlier Greek thinking. And what did they say? Well, they took Steno's principles and said if the bottom layer formed first, then the world is simply too old for the Bible to be true. It takes vast periods of time to build up sediment and to build up the next layer and the next layer. There's no way that the Bible could be true if this is actually correct. Then enter Charles Lyell, who wrote a book which I also have. It's a huge, great big, thick book. This is just the first part. It's a two-part book. Principles of Geology, or the modern changes of Earth and its inhabitants considered as illustrative of geology. Now, a whole massive section of this book is dedicated to James Hutton and his principle of uniformitarianism. He took James Hutton's principle of uniformitarianism, he expanded on it, he traveled the world, and he promoted this theory of uniformitarianism aimed to remove God from people's thinking. I mean, he even admitted it himself. And his philosophy was simple. If the bottom layer got there first, then the bottom animals are the oldest. So the rock layers are a record of the history of life over vast ages, which is completely different to what the Bible teaches. Do you see the natural progression? And then Charles Darwin came in, a promoter of evolutionary thinking, who built off the back of Lyell and the earlier principles brought back from the Greeks by the French revolutionaries and passed on to his grandfather Erasmus. And he simply argued, well, if this really is a record of life on Earth, then the top creatures must have evolved from the lower ones over millions of years. So the Bible is totally false about creation and Noah's flood. All right, let's look a little bit deeper into Charles Lyell. There's his principle of uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. All things in geology must be explained by processes observable today. We don't see a global flood today, therefore it simply can't be true. Lyell and Darwin were a time team. They worked together. Charles Darwin Charles Lyell was a mentor for Charles Darwin. And they go on field trips that creation research has been on, to this very same place, to the rocks that we now call Ordovician, not named after millions of years, but named after the extinct Celtic tribe that used to live in Wales, the Ordovici tribe. And you can find some fabulous fossils. Hey, you should come on some of our creation research field trips sometimes. You can find some lovely snail fossils. Oh, you see the fossil snail there on the left? You see the modern snail on the right? I mean, there's not a lot of difference between them. But Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin visited this place and they applied their pagan philosophy. Darwin said that each species of snail would take 20 million years to evolve into the next species. Lyell simply counted up the different snails and said, therefore, the Ordovician must be at least 240 million years old. In fact, the Ordovician is now believed to be well over 450 million years old. It's interesting how people keep changing their mind. Key concepts: evolution, no need for God; anti-catastrophism, no need for Noah's flood, no need for judgment, and you can tell the age of the rock by the fossils that are in it. These are the key concepts that Charles Lyell promoted. And by the time we get to Darwin, the Earth was several million years old, a resurgence of the Greek and the pagan philosophical ideas. Okay, Charles Lyell's motive for writing the principles of geology, his motive for promoting our very vast old Earth. I conceived the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic geology, that's Genesis geology, could be set down without giving offence, it would be in a historical sketch. Stephen Gould, famous paleontologist, very honest paleontologist, said Charles Lyell was a lawyer by profession, and his book is one of the most brilliant briefs published by an advocate. Lyell relied upon true bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian views as the only true geology. First, he set up a straw man to demolish. In fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. The geologic column does require catastrophes. Rocks are fractured and contorted, and whole faunas are wiped out. Interesting clash of ideas there. What's the real problem? There it is there. The present is the key to the past. Lyell's entire principle of uniformitarianism based off the present being the key to the processes of the past. Whereas the Bible says the present is not the key to the past, but the past is key to the present. What happened in the past explains the condition we're in today. What happened in the past explains why we're in sin today. What happened in the past explains the rocks that we see around us. What happened in the past explains why we need a saviour. Problem number 1. Note very well. Any dating method, such as carbon-14, starlight same speed, radioactive dates, chalk or limestone formation, or any geological history, based on Lyell's uniformitarian assumption, will always contradict the biblical account of a 6th day of creation and the Noah's flood, simply because Lyell's aim was to free the science from Moses. Moses? Oh yeah, this is his own writing. His entire aim, he said, was to free the science from Moses. Not to free science from the Bible, that would have been a bit too obvious. But what was Moses attributed with writing? The first few books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And of course a little bit of the Psalms. In there, you find the creation of the world, you find the fall of mankind, you find the judgment of God and a change of the world's climate and geological record at Noah's flood. You find the judgment and the history, judgment of God and the history of mankind at the Tower of Babel, and you find the giving of the law of God. Get rid of those 5 things, and the rest of the Bible comes tumbling down with it. Note well, and as we will discover as we move forward with these programs, it's not the evidence that disagrees with the biblical record of 6-day creation and Noah's flood over the last 6,000 to 7,000 years. It's the opinions of men who willfully set out to reject and replace the word of God. And we notice that key verse from 2 Peter earlier today. Lyell simply replaced Genesis and Darwin rewrote it. And Lyell's most famous disciple was Charles Darwin. Even he admitted, I always feel my books came half out of Lyell's brain and I never acknowledged this sufficiently enough. I've always thought of the great merit of the principles of geology and the way that it's altered my thinking, says Charles Darwin. How old? By the latter part of the 19th century, Lyell and Darwin were using the rates of erosion and the deposition to estimate that the Earth was hundreds of millions of years old, even up to 400 million years old. The point to finish on? If you take the pagan-inspired philosophy that Lyell and Darwin promoted as your authority, then you're going to have issues accepting the Bible's version of events. But realize it's not an issue of evidence, it's an issue of who or what your authority is. So back to our geological column. There's the standard geological column, the oldest rocks at the bottom, the youngest rocks at the top. You can see the dates along the right-hand side. The bottom to top philosophy is based off of Steno's principle. The Cambrian rocks got there first, the Quaternary rocks got there last. That's what Steno introduced. But that's as far as Steno went. The oldest to the youngest philosophy is based off of Hutton and Lyell's principles of geology, the present being the key to the past. They went several steps further than Steno ever did, but they took his philosophy, took it to its logical conclusion. If the bottom rocks got there first and the top rocks got there last, the bottom rocks are the oldest, the top rocks are the youngest. The deep time philosophy is based off of the Hutton and Lyell principles of the present being the key to the past, which themselves are based off of the anti-God French revolutionaries, which themselves based their thinking off of the anti-God pagan Greeks, which themselves based it off of an anti-God pagan Babylonian. You realize how far the history goes? All right, some column questions to take us forward. Is the column actually an accurate representation of Earth rocks? Is the column a good basis for interpreting flood geology? Does the column actually represent an accurate rock sedimentation in the first place? And can we even use the column for determining flood boundaries? Many people are looking for a big black marker to go, there's the boundary, where the reality is it's based off of, even if you get rid of the millions of years, even if you take it back to Steno's principles, it's still based off of this philosophy of superposition. The bottom got there first, the top got there last. Did we actually go wrong somewhere? Well, I believe that's the end of my little section, so I'll hand over to John. We might throw it open for a few questions on what we've done so far, but John is going to take us on to our next step. All right, we've dealt with the history, we've dealt with the issues of the principles of geology. What do the rocks actually say when you go and study them? And I've got a rather interesting rock, which I'm just going to tease you with, which we're going to have a little chat about, me and John, to introduce the next segment right here. It's a rather beautiful rock. You see all the swirly whirly patterns? Well, we'll come on to that in just a moment.
Side bit here, which is probably a good way to introduce the question time. And then, Donnie can govern how many questions, but remember, I've got a staff coming at 10, so I would have to leave then. There's one here that says, does the KT boundary pose a problem for a post-flood boundary and flood geology in general? Now, most people who are into geology have read about it. Very few people have followed it all around the planet like me. So you can come across it outside of Dudley in England. Joseph, that quarry we took you to with the Dudley bugs, trilobites, right? And I've followed it through in Scotland, a lot of exposed granites and things like that. And you can actually follow it all the way through Europe. I've been to quite a few places in Europe where it shows up. You can see it particularly on the dinosaur fields in the USA, where it became predominant, with the theory that says you get this layer, the layer of the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary, and it's characterized particularly as the marker place for the end of the Triceratops, and also asteroidal or meteoric impact of dust, right? You can also see it. Come with me to New Zealand. I'll take you on a dinosaur dig. I go over there and show you where it is. It's about 100 meters from where the dinosaurs are that we dig up, and we're actually in some of our movies. So if you haven't seen our Darwin series, go to our website, creationresearch.net, go to streaming, look for the Darwin series, Darwin on the Rocks, Darwin's natural evolution, etc. You will enjoy that and see some of these boundaries for yourself. But the answer is, does it pose a problem? The answer is no, because my first observation comes from Montana, where you can actually see the boundary and then you find a Triceratops above it. So is it actually a boundary? There's the first question. That's really the point that Joseph's been asking all along. Do these boundaries actually represent reality, or are they artificial definitions with a hidden philosophy behind? I mean, the philosophy that says this was the meteorite that bombed out the dinosaurs. Well, Professor Derek Ager makes a very good point about the KT boundary. He says this is basically microscopic meteoric dust. He said it's not going to settle down until the water is all still. So it cannot represent a catastrophic bombardment that killed off the dinosaurs if the Triceratops is still above it, and you've got this dust which is not going to settle out until everything's absolutely still. So you've got to realize that when you're dealing with modern geology, the assumptions that Joseph took us through and the history, come on, let's be honest, did you really enjoy history at school? Did you really read your homework? No, I didn't. I used to go and read a comic version of the same thing and try and remember the highlights. So most people skip history, and yet the key ways we think are embedded in history. As I keep saying, if you want to understand tomorrow, if you want to deal with today, go back to yesterday and go there very often. These layers are sometimes arbitrarily defined. And in fact, can I encourage you, and many of you won't be able to do this, if you're a geologist, go to a boundary conference, where they're trying to decide where the boundaries are. And if you think we've got a tough subject here dealing with the boundaries of the flood, you go and enjoy a good laugh at a boundary conference. Is this where the Ordovician finishes, or is it up there? Derek Ager's comment really removes the KT boundary as any problem at all. And I've got to be honest, he's one of my favorite geologists, even though he said, you creationists get out here, don't use this book. It's full of wonderful evidence that the biblical record is valid for one simple reason. He said that creationist geologists, the catastrophists, he calls them, were far more objective and scientific than he and the modern evolutionists, non-catastrophists, are. So that's my little contribution there. You might want to suggest a question or two here, Donnie, before we give it back to me in 10 minutes at the most.
Sure. Yeah. Out of all these questions, I'll save a lot of them, especially if they're not directly related to the flood boundaries topic. We can maybe get to a couple of them at the end of, day one here. But I will ask, this is a question of my own, actually, in light of your presentation here, Joe. And fantastic presentation, opening presentation. I appreciated it. And in light of the information you provided regarding the history, including church fathers, what would you say to one of these theistic evolutionists who claim young earth creation is a new invention? The church fathers did not believe the Bible taught a young earth, or a global flood for that matter. And apparently modern day young earth creation is a Seventh-day Adventist invention. I'm not sure if you've heard that, but that claim has been thrown around a lot.
All right, I'll share my screen very, very quickly just to do a couple of very quick slides. And we probably should hand on to John after this so he has enough time.
Yes.
It's very, very easy to disprove. And by the way, there's a whole 2 or 3 hour program that me and John do, John predominantly does into this, right? Let's just run through a few quick quotes, right? Is the 6,000 years the result of modern fundamentalist thinking? And again, one of the promotions is that it was this sort of Seventh-day Adventist thinking that was introduced very, very recently. We've already talked about Theophilus of Antioch, right? I mean, this is AD 115, so only just a very early into the church, before the real takeover of Roman Catholicism. Creation occurred at 5,529 BC, plus or minus 2,000 years. So again, you're looking at what we would currently, or around today, refer to as a young Earth. It's certainly a date of under 10,000 years. It's around 8,000 years, not the tens of thousands as Plato has written. We've dealt with this quote as well, the fact that the whole philosophy based on the old Chaldeans is wrong, because we know that the world has the 6,000 year has not yet completed. 280, 100 years after Theophilus of Antioch. Augustine, another 100 years after, 6,000 years. You're starting to see a bit of a pattern here. Martin Luther, and I think John may even comment on Martin Luther as we go forward, because he was one of the first people to actually talk about fossil wood, right, based on his father's experience from the coal mines. Now, we know from Moses that about 6,000 years ago, the world was not yet in existence. 6,000 years. John Calvin on the age of the earth, albeit the duration of the world, now declining to its ultimate end, has not yet attained 6,000 years. God's work was completed not in a moment, but in 6 days. John Calvin. William Shakespeare. The poor world is almost 6,000 years old, from 1599. I mean, this is William Shakespeare, right? And you love the old Shakespeare. I find it a bit boring myself personally, but you've got to admit the influence that he had on language, and the way that he would take language and actually manipulate it to make a point that the modern for his time, but the ordinary person could actually understand, was incredible. 6,000 years. Popular belief, even 1599. Archbishop James Ussher is the famous one, of course, 1581. Expert in Semitic languages, historian and scholar. In Ireland, he was one of the only archbishops to be the Archbishop of the Catholic and the Anglican Church. He said the world was created in 4004 BC, or around 6,000 years ago. So no, it's not a modern invention in the slightest. It's based directly out of Scripture. You can find lots of references throughout Scripture as well, talking about things in the past that refer to a young earth as well. Even Jesus himself referred to the implication of a young earth when he said, from the beginning, I've made them male and female. Right? So you'll find not only in Scripture, but also in history, it's a common belief that the earth was less than 10,000 years old, and somewhere around the 6,000 to 8,000 years old at the most. Not a modern day invention in the slightest. So I'll just leave it there. It's a very easy one to kind of get rid of.
I'd encourage the listeners, Donnie, the guy who gets most abuse out of this is Augustine. He's the one that the old earthers like to claim as a hero, as not believing in 6,000 years, and they never quote this verse that Joseph put up. And yet there's no beyond a shadow of a doubt, Augustine may not have known some of the things about Genesis, because he talks about the stars. Did that mean angels? He's got all sorts of interesting questions, but he is emphatic on the 6,000 bit, because it was popular. I mean, from Tertullian, the guy who had the fossil shell and that introduced our subject. So those of you who've been misled by books about Augustine's liberality on having no value for the age of the earth, wake up, open your eyes. You have been deceived, sadly, by, I've got to say, at the best, ignorant Christians who are misusing Augustine, and they need to get back, whether it's Calvin, Luther, any of the reformers, or even good old Shakespeare that Joseph. Did I detect that you didn't like Shakespeare?
Oh no, I do. I very much appreciate Shakespeare. It's just my first experience of Shakespeare was being forced to watch through about 3 hours of it when I was first dating my wife. So
to be or not to be, hey?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Nothing else you want to raise at the moment, Donnie, because I'll go on to my section if we can.
Absolutely. Let's hand it over to you, John. Okay, fantastic answer to what I believe is a pretty weak criticism of young Earth creation. So great job. And I got your slide up, John. So whenever you're ready.
That's good. Okay, again, you'll like our new logo. Go to creationresearch.net. If you want to see what I'm about to do, you'll find there's a whole series of programs in there that deal with our latest experiments. So go to creationresearch.net, click onto the museum section, or click through to the research page, and you'll find fabulous stuff there. Basically, this section here is not only going to remind you about the flood, but the reason my lecturers in geology at Queensland University at the end of the first week said we're not going to discuss any catastrophic rubbish. And they mentioned Noah's flood and creation. And the logic of that was, we don't want to even be reminded that there is a God who judges. Well, there's what the Bible says. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, all that was on the dry land died. So what's this got to do with the geologic column? Well, there's no doubt about it. My lecturers saw the geologic column as the best way of squashing Noah's flood. And given the bit of history you've seen, you know now why, through Lyell, the Greeks, etc. And it's very evident that if Noah's flood is real, it should show up somewhere. So let's start on a study of how layers form. Now, I took many years to actually come to grips with the real problem here is how we think layers form. So let's take you to Coal Creek in Seattle, where one year I was over there, and I'm truly grateful to God for helping me to travel from, basically Alaska to the edge of Antarctica. There was a flood. See the destruction it had brought down? The trees? This is the last couple of days of the flood, because I sat beside this little creek. Well, it was little after the flood was down, and I watched what it did. What does the Bible say? Study to show yourself approved about Scripture. It also says, search out the truth and test everything. Well, there's a gentle stream, hardly doing anything. But a few days early, because I deliberately sat for 3 days watching this creek. And as the water went down, look what you can see. Can you see the layers? Great. Now get up close. Can you see they are light and dark and light and dark? You've actually got strata. And this formed in 3 days. In fact, the road, the big pipe under the motorway had gotten blocked, a lake had formed, and so we had water running into a water barrier or a lake. Look, so that's what it formed. That wasn't there before that. It's even surrounding the bottom of the trees. It's running over some of the things that you could say, well, if they stayed buried, they'd turn into fossils. Would they? How long does it take to make a fossil? But when you actually look at this, as I watched, you ended up with 300 layers in 3 days. But the interesting thing was they weren't flat. My geological training basically said Dino was right. Original horizontality, superposition, lateral continuity. Yep, they're the big words that Dino comes up with. But you and I have a glass of water in a primary school classroom, elementary class. We put sand and mud and rocks in it, we shake it up and down, and the big rocks fall to the bottom, then the sand, then the mud, and the teacher says that's how layers form. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, a great experiment if the world was a glass of water. But the world isn't. The world is a place of floods and rain. Now you have a look at this. Getting close up, here's what you find. Okay, I counted them. You have some 100 layers that formed in 3 days. Yes, I got very uncomfortable sitting in the forest, watching what the layers would do, counting them all. What they actually did was they matched the number of storm pulses. They didn't match time in any longitudinal sense. And the second thing, even though many of them are nicely stratified, Steno's principle that things form horizontally is not actually true. I mean, when you have a look at the layers and say the bottom layer formed first, and then the layers form in nice continuous beds, they actually don't. There's no such thing in a flood deposit about original horizontality. But yet, when you think about it, Steno, who said, here's how layers form, when it formed in the real world, the first deposition was at the end on the right of the slide, and the final deposition ended up downstream on the left of the slide. In other words, the layers were forming from upstream to downstream, not from top to bottom. Now, by the time you go back to Dino and think it through, he says the strata are laid down one on top of the other. By the time you go a little bit further, you're finding that Dino is famous for proving that tungstones are fossil shark's teeth, and his fame far outweighed the actual evidence he used for his strata. Oh, he was absolutely right about shark's teeth and shells. But he went on and said, followed by John Ray, that if Dino is right, as Joseph mentioned, the world is a great deal older than is imagined or believed. In John Ray's day, people believed the Bible. Dino believed the Bible. Dino did great work when it came to shark's teeth, and that's why he gets into the literature. He never did any experiments, perhaps the shake up and down of the sharks, of the glass. He never did any experiments on watching how strata form. Why did John Ray take that position? Very simply, if you've got layers with fossils in it, and then you've got another layer on top, then another layer, the animals had to live and die and get buried in the layer. That takes time. And then if you've got a million layers, there's an awful lot of life, death, and birth involved in it. All right, that leads us up to today. Why do people actually think the world is so old? Well, the answer is simple. I gave this presentation at many places. Oxford, I debated the professor of geology at Oxford. I presented it to the Cambridge Union. I've given papers to the Cole Conference. So it's not just creationists running around shooting their mouth off. For the last 10 years, we've been doing experiments at Jurassic Ark, some of which you're about to see. Okay, you can see at creationresearch.net, click exciting research and search rock layers. Why do people believe the world is old? There's three contenders. Okay, why do they go away thinking what the guide said is true? 600 million years ago. Wow. How could the Bible be true if the rocks are so old? Is how everybody leaves the Grand Canyon. They may be impressed by the size of the hole, but that's what they've been taught. The younger rocks are at the top, the older layers are at the bottom. And there isn't one guide at the Grand Canyon who's ever seen that happen. But here's the consequence. If the bottom layers got there first, then the creatures in the bottom lived and died first. And if you keep making layers with more creatures in, you have to add up how long it takes for them to be born, how long they live, and how long it takes them to die and get buried. And then you get Charles Darwin come along, and on top of the vast amounts of lifespan time, you have to explain not only how they got fossilized, but the reason why they're different. If the rocks in the bottom have different animals than the rocks in the top, you must use evolution, because Noah's flood and creation is already out the window. Now, there's one of my textbooks with the geologic column in it, and it's associated with millions of years of evolution. So any Christian out there who thinks that the geologic column only deals with the fossils and tries to prove creation, you're going to be shot in the foot. Because what's the whole basis of the geologic column? Joseph and I are well known for talking about our summary of that verse. Watch out for false science. The old Greek word science simply means knowledge. So when you read a modern translation that says beware of false knowledge, you are talking about the same thing. Doesn't matter whether it's politics, physics, chemistry, or geology. Likewise, when it says test all things, you should be testing even the Christians who say the rocks took millions of years to get there, or the fossils started only here or finished there. Remember what Joseph said about the shark? Yes, Dino did great work. But when it came to dealing with layers, he made suppositions. The bottom layer gets there first. Now, what is false science? Here's my first clue. Now, I've been studying this for a long time, had the privilege of traveling all over the KT boundary, having walked up and down the Grand Canyon many, many times, keeps me fit in my middle to old age. But I remember my old geology professor who came in one day, and he was very blunt, and he said, "Chaps, I hate to tell you this, but the rocks in the Grand Canyon get old sideways." Now, that is not the impression every other lecturer gave me, but he was the head of the department. He needed to be listened to. But sadly, he never said anything else about that rock at all. He never once again told us, well, how do you prove the rock layers got old sideways? Okay, think carefully. Everybody knows the layers in the Grand Canyon are associated with water, but almost nobody, because of the glass and the sand and the mud and the rock experiment, never thinks through the next step. Only moving water can erode rock and carry mud and sand, but it always moves sideways unless it goes over the edge of a waterfall, which means one thing. If you're going to form rock layers, then you have to think about the creek that I sat in. You know, Coal Creek back there 30 years ago in Seattle. The rock layers will grow in the direction of the current. The bottom layer, therefore, will not get there first. The left side, upstream, will be older than the right side, downstream. Can the top layer, therefore, ever be the youngest? Now, as I said, you can see much of this on our creationresearch.net. Click Exciting Research. So if I'm going too fast or we miss, you know, a bit of detail that you need, you will find a lot more. Go and explore Jurassic Ark and look back. We even record this. There's Dr. Diane Eager. There's young Joe in Australia. Boy, it seems so long ago, pre-COVID, right? This is one of our strata machines. We invented it to run tests on sideways water. We're up to number 9 at those days. And no, our work wasn't original. We give full credit to someone who's moderately unpopular in creationist circles, Johannes Volter. No, you've never heard of him? Well, you see, he's almost unknown in creationist circles, even if he is unpopular. I got to give credit to an old university librarian who said, I have a German copy of this and a translation. Who is he? Well, he's actually the guy who walked over the delta in Venice and made an observation that the layers on the top match the order of the layers underneath. So, well, this guy is one of the few moderns who took him seriously. And I was in the Colorado University of Mines when he was running his experiments over in the USA. Look at his qualifications, way more than mine. He's a member of the French Geological Society. Now, that may not impress the English, but ignore racial backgrounds and history backgrounds. Concentrate on what he did. Okay, look what he's written. Berthold, G, sedimentary experiments on lamentation of sediments. Not lamentation, lamination. I was getting the Book of Job mixed up there. You'll find he's a well-published guy, and I've just put 2 of the main important ones. You can actually see his experiments. Now, he gained a bit of popularity, and his popularity died. And the criticism is usually, well, this only explains the sediments you find in deltas, because that's where Volta started his work. Well, here's Clem. There's Joe. Yes, we pay a fortune for our experimental equipment. Can you see we make do? Look at that bathtub. That's our water and mud supply. We're filling it up with water. That's easy. We have to pump it into that strata machine. How are we doing it? Well, whoops, we've gone, there we are. Right. What we've got is our strata machine connected up via a Venturi pump. Now, Clem invented the Venturi pump, and it pumps it through so that we don't get accused of mixing up the layers as we add it. So 2018, here's our test of this big one. And what we found, our Mark 6 strata machine in front of the children. By the way, you do know children love water. Yes, they do. But the adults were there too. We had over 400 people there watching this experiment. And no, they couldn't all fit, hence we posted it on the website. The water is coming in from one side. The sediment is evenly mixed, big particles, little particles, black particles, white particles. And there's no doubt about it, the deposition is forming from left to right. The water's coming in from left. That's how it formed in the stream in Washington State. Now you'll see the bottom of the strata machine here is made of marine waterproof ply. That's the first lot of layers. But what you've got is some layers of sediment on top of it. See them? Black, white, black, white, black, white. Now, where have you seen that before? Answer, in the creek bed at Coal Creek in Washington State. And the whole sedimentary process there of black, white, black, white, black, white took 2 minutes. Joseph will verify that. And it formed sideways. And then, of course, we've run many experiments here, and we've actually done a few things. When we've filled up the sediment, we actually then chop it in 2 to see what's inside, because you need to test all things. Now, have you seen anything like this lately? You chop up the middle, and you see strata after strata, black, white, black, white, black, white. Getting familiar yet? How about something like that? Where my old professor said, hate to tell you this, chaps, but the layers in the Grand Canyon form sideways. Now, I've walked through the Grand Canyon, I've camped in the Grand Canyon, I've walked up it, I've walked down it, and I've got no doubt about my professor was absolutely right. You're not dealing with vertical time here, you're dealing with mostly a horizontal process. The material is coming from one side and it's gone sideways. Now, having a US base in Tennessee, I can show you the mountains in the east of Tennessee where some of the rocks that you can find in the Grand Canyon Coconino sandstone actually come from. They have traveled sideways for a long way and been well enough preserved to be recognized. But these kids should be told it does not represent millions of years. It does not represent history from bottom to top. We need to rethink. It represents history from left to right, or upstream to downstream. You see, it forms sideways, which brings these horrifying implications even for creationists. You see, they like to dismiss our friend, the French guy Guy Barteau, and saying it applies to deltas. It does apply to deltas. But have you ever thought that in Noah's flood, the deltas would cover much of the earth? What is a delta? Where water's coming from one direction, it's got a bunch of sediment in it, and all of a sudden it meets a barrier like water that slows it down. That's going to happen whether you have land around the edge of the water supply or whether it's just happening underwater, and the only barriers are actually water barriers. You'll have to think seriously about that one. All right, the layer at the top formed first, and the layer at the end formed second. Of course it did. You see, it actually was coming from upstream to downstream. That actually changes an awful lot. So when you get the older on the left and the younger on the right, all the kids who sat there and watched that would have to say, that's correct. We had some geologists from the mines department come and they didn't like what we were doing, but they had to say, that's correct. Which fossil is the oldest? Well, you see, the one that's the oldest up there is the one that would have formed first. How much shorter in time did the one on the right? Is it early enough to say it's younger than the one on the top left? Because that would really throw your geologic column into chaos. But the one thing you can conclude is that history goes sideways. It does not go from bottom to top. And that would demolish everything that Charles Darwin sought to do. Wow, that requires some rethinking. Which means, of course, that if you use the fossils to determine evolution, you would actually not have evolution. Perhaps that's why there's so many gaps in the record. And tomorrow, when Joseph and I touch on the geological record, we will deal with our climbing up and down the geologic column in the Grand Canyon in Australia, in many other places, and showing you that history goes sideways. As I said, you can see all of this, see our results on creationresearch.net. See the exciting research rock layers, because I'm having to go faster than 4.6 million years. I'm even having to go faster than 6,000 years. And you can donate to us. Joseph's already mentioned these verses about the reason for abandoning Noah's flood is to do with scoffers coming. And as I move into the final section for this, it's deliberate. Charles Lyell deliberately tempted to get rid of Moses, Noah's flood in particular. They deliberately want to ignore the flood judgment. Let me just show you one other thing to verify some of this, and then we'll let you have questions. You may even catch me for a question here. We dug a hole at Jurassic Ark. Holy ground, you could call it, because we were actually putting in a new septic tank. And as we put in a septic tank, we noticed, well, we call it Jurassic Ark because the rocks are Jurassic. How do the geologists determine that? The fossils we find at Jurassic Ark are the same as the ones you find in the Jura Mountains in Europe. And the name Jurassic, originally the concept is coined by Alexander von Humboldt, and he was a six-day Noah's flood creationist who saw no problem with using a term that implied the rocks in the Jura can go all around the planet and are similar fossils. Okay, this is Jurassic rock. There is some down there. You see my hammer there? Or you can see a black layer. Well, it turns out we've got the southern end of the Jurassic coal fields in our Jurassic Ark. We didn't even know this. There's a big advantage in digging septic pits. It's Jurassic rock. It's got Jurassic coal. But you see that section that's poking out? I thought, I wonder if we can prove this in reverse. So we actually chopped it out. There's the block in the sediment. It's underneath the coal layer. The coal layer is the marker. The Tyro coalfields are just sort of half an hour north of where we are. So we have an absolute geological marker in terms of normal time scales, you know, the one the geologist uses. So let's take that piece of rock, go close up. Look at that. Black, white, black, white, black, white, black, white. Here's a close-up of it. Black, white, black, white, black, white. Here's my assistants that day. There's Clem and there's James. We're in a shed. We're smashing rock. We need to then pulverize it into fine grains. And there's me doing the hard yakka of shoveling it up so it ends up in our strata machine. What are we trying to do? Well, we're arguing one simple thing. We're investigating at this point. If you claim it takes millions of years to form rock and they form one on top of the other, then if we claim it's the reverse and the one on top of the other results from sideways motion, we should be able to reconstruct the rock in a very little time with sideways motion. There's Clem, trial number 3. We did this 10 times just to verify it's what happened. Sediment goes in one end, sediment pours out, sediment forms layers. The layers, well, there they are, thick black one at the top. And can you see underneath it? Let's go a bit closer. Look at that. There's comparison to, oh, no, that's the one we just made. Here's the original rock. Hey, the reconstruction, how long did it take? Well, 20 minutes just to be sure. And we did it 10 times. You want a comparison? We'll do it for you. Whoops. Can you see the original rock? Can you see the reconstituted one? It did not form a puddle of blackish grey rock with no separations. It formed in 20 minutes like the original one. I mean, you take a sediment with 100 layers like we've got here, or 1,000 layers, and theoretically, you're looking at vast amounts of time. To reform the same rock with 100 layers, 1,000 layers, doesn't take time. It takes a process. That's been our key, and it will continue to be our key. The rock layers actually provably grow in the direction of the current. The bottom layer is not necessarily the oldest. Now, let me throw in a commercial here, because some of you, I'm sure, were Christians and you're fascinated already. We're going to follow up this tomorrow again in detail. I've got to leave in 5 minutes. So I'm burdening Joe with all the questions. But if you're a Christian out there, particularly in Australia, we have one need. You can pray for it, particularly because we have quite a few people who work with us, but we need one young man like Joe. He's been stuck out of Australia. We need someone in Australia. He loves Jesus. He loves God's word. He's got his science qualifications in geology. He's willing to be trained to teach as well as to preach and to work full time for creation research. You might be interested. Send us an email, and we'd love to hear from you. Go and get our address of creationresearch.net. Now, we'll continue on with more of this tomorrow in the geologic column. So if you want to switch my PowerPoint off there, Donnie, switch us all on the screen, and I'll sort of, in 7 or 8 minutes, excuse me, folks, my staff will be arriving. I have to leave.
Completely understandable. I do have to say, before we get to some of these audience questions, I love how thorough both of you are, John and Joe. So fantastic presentation so far. And I love to see the fact that the audience is so engaged in this topic. And I know there's a lot of information being thrown at everybody. This is an incredibly important topic. So of course, if tonight, since we have day 2 tomorrow, there's a question that comes to mind, make sure to bring it tomorrow as well. I'm going to hand it over to you, Joe.
Jump in very quickly and make the point that one of the good things about doing this over 2 days is that it allows me and John to kind of gauge our audience in one sense. So we're looking at some of the questions, and Donnie's, for those who don't know, Donnie's been taking the questions and sort of putting it on the private chat so we can see them all without having to dive through all the main chat, right? And that's really useful because it gives us a bit of a perspective. So when we come to do it tomorrow, we're kind of writing the program as we go, not in terms of content necessarily, but in terms of how we're structuring stuff together. So when it comes tomorrow, we'll be able to know exactly where we're going in terms of the next boundaries and the flood and geological column and all that kind of stuff. So it should be pretty good tomorrow. And John, will we have more time tomorrow with you to go through questions in more depth?
Yes, I'm pretty sure you will tomorrow. I
Yeah.
think I've got people coming in at lunchtime tomorrow, so
Oh, that's
give us
fine.
a few more hours. I can see one that I'm going to take a bit of a shot at here, and then hand
Sure.
it over to you, Joe, because it's much more your area. Remember the rock I showed you first, the one with the stromatolite in it, right? Now
Yeah.
this is limestone. Now the interesting thing about stromatolites is they're self rocks. They form rocks anyway, and the stromatolites are still here, and they actually exude a limey glue. When we've made stalactites and stalagmites, we've discovered that you get leaves that will stick on the stalactite, and even bats and insects and flies, they'll land on and they'll get stuck, because the organic lime plus bacteria actually makes a natural glue. So when you look at the layers in this one, the funny contradiction, of course, is the name of this means layered thing, but it's sitting in rock here, which is most likely simply made by the organism itself. So there's a question here. It's limestone, and it says, could we get another answer to the still repeated limestone argument that people argue it does not form in flood deposits? Now, I've seen limestone form just in our strata machine. I've seen limestone form in our fossil tank deposit, where we actually show the trees standing upright and the calcium carbonate will fall out of solution. And you can see crystals of calcium carbonate forming on the spot. Vance Nelson, one of our colleagues in Canada, sent me the other day a metal cast, a pipe that comes from a hot water spring, and it's full of calcite crystals. It takes a maximum of 6 weeks for this pipe to clog up. It does not take a vast amount of time for limestone. The flow is following very, it's a catastrophic deposit, and yet the crystals are actually forming. So, Joe, you have lots of interesting limestone on the east coast there, and you and I have climbed all up and down the Cretaceous, the White Cliffs of Dover, etc. I've seen them all along the boundaries of the Mediterranean, right across to Turkey, photos of all of them there. So you're more experienced with some rather interesting limestone on the east coast of England.
Indeed, I've spent most of my life sitting on top of 1,000 feet of limestone. We have some of the deepest chalk and limestone deposits in the world, and we have a huge abundance of limestone and chalk here in the UK as well. So I'm very, very familiar with it. We've dealt with limestone many times before. Let me just give you a few interesting points. Number one, you've got to make sure you have a distinction. A common misnomer is that all limestone is made up of marine sea creatures. And the argument is you require a warm, shallow kind of marine environment, water environment, lagoon-like environment, where you get the planktonic blooms and the seashells and the creatures which slowly settle down, and over hundreds of thousands or millions of years you build it up into a calcareous ooze, which over hundreds of thousands of millions more years it compresses into chalk, right? Number one, the vast majority of chalk and limestone deposits in the UK are very, very pure, particularly the case of the White Cliffs of Dover, right? They're called that for a reason. So you don't have any indication there of vast ages of slow accumulation, because they're really pure. They're up to 98 to 99% pure calcite, right? No grit, no muck, no ooze. Now, you do get some grey chalk formations where there's certainly muck and ooze and stuff that's kind of got caught up in it. Is that an indication of slow, gradual deposition? In fact, a lot of limestones are grey because of the contamination. Is that evidence of slow, gradual formation? Well, at that point, you then need to turn to the fossils, right? But the first thing to say is not all limestone is made up of marine fossils. You can get chemical limestone as well. In fact, calcium carbonate, the formation of it's a chemical equation. So you get quite a lot of limestone which has got no fossils in it whatsoever. It's purely a chemical solution, and you have examples of that forming very, very quickly today. In fact, one argument is that it has to form quickly if it's purely a chemical solution, and it has to form under flow. All right, for the ones that are fossiliferous, you can look at the fossils. What do the fossils indicate? I mean, the very presence of macrofossils. I mean, the vast majority of the chalk and limestone is made up of coccolithophores or foraminifera, which are tiny little sort of microscopic plankton, right? But you do get very, very large fossils buried in this chalk and limestone as well. Now, the very presence of the large macrofossils in the chalk and limestone is evidence that it was buried very quickly, because if you take hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, you'd never get a fossil. All right, time will destroy your creature long before it has time to turn into a fossil. Then you can look at the evidence of transportation. Transportation, have these creatures lived and died and settled in the one area and slowly been built up, or is there indication that they have been swept into position? So you can go and do research projects. I did a 3-month research project for university. My first paper published was on the evidence of transportation and rapid burial in the fossils of Hunstanton. We did other reports and research projects on the belemnites of Whitby. Right, belemnites are a squid-like creature. They're elongated. First year of geology, I was taught elongated things like trees or belemnites or shells. If they're pointing in the same way, you've got evidence of transportation. Water has flown through and swept these into position and has made them point in the same direction. You can run this experiment yourself. It's well established in geology. You can see it in the log jams of Jurassic Ark and everything else in between. One thing that we consistently found, and it's not just in the limestone deposits of the UK, it's around the world as well as we've traveled, is that up to 97% of all fossils showed evidence of transportation. That means that they were buried in flowing water. So therefore, this calcareous ooze that they're buried in before it got sort of chemically altered into what we would now refer to as limestone, it was buried in a great big slurry, flowing in one direction, sweeping the fossils along and burying it down as well. And by the way, yes, the dominant view in geology is that this is a slow, gradual process, but it's certainly not the only view. There are multiple publications now starting to come out in the scientific literature which talks about limestone being buried under flowing water. To give you one example, we've got a paper up in front of me from the Journal of Sedimentary Research, very prestigious paper published in 2013. The observations we report, they say, suggest that published interpretations of ancient lime muds and derived Paleocean geographic conditions will need to be re-evaluated, rethought. Why? Because observations from modern carbonate environments, that's limestone production, and from the rock record itself, that's looking at the rocks and the fossils, suggest that deposition of carbonate muds, that's your calcareous ooze, calcium carbonate is your limestone, by currents is likely common throughout geological history. That's not what you read when you go to your beach and you look at your signpost or you pick up your university textbook or high school textbook, but this is what's in the scientific literature. Similarly, conventional wisdom, by the way, conventional wisdom is Lyell, and his principle of present is the key to the past, right? Uniformitarianism based off of Steno's superposition. Conventional wisdom about low energy requirements for shale and limestone deposition discouraged geologists from entertaining high energy alternatives for many years. It's therefore very possible that more carbonate muds will be interpreted as high energy deposits once the science behind the concept becomes established. In other words, calcium carbonate, limestone, chalk, whatever you want to call it, it has nothing to do with time. It has everything to do with the process. It can be a chemical process, it can be a water-based process mixed with a chemical process, but either way, no issue with fitting it into a large global flood with flowing waters and currents, particularly in light of the strata experiments that we've briefly talked about tonight, and we'll go into more detail tomorrow.
Another awesome and thorough answer there, Indiana Joe. I'm kind of flabbergasted. It looks like John Mackay
John disappeared. Yeah.
So he's left us. It is now 10 a.m. I believe for him. So he will be back here with us tomorrow, same time, guys, for part 2. And I believe, Joe, we'll probably try and wrap this up at the 2-hour mark.
Wrap this up fairly because it's just gone 1 o'clock in the morning here for me. So I want to be bright and refreshed and ready for tomorrow, and I've got to do some chatting with John in preparation. But there we go.
Amen, brother. And right now we're at the hour and 50-minute mark, so maybe we'll have time with how thorough your answers are. We'll do one more question, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
We'll see what we got.
And one thing I wanted to say too to the audience, especially because we're pretty close to 9,000 subscribers, and we've had a lot of new supporters and subscribers since your last show, Joe. Maybe, I don't know, going on 8 months ago, you came on and gave probably the most thorough presentation on limestone that exists on the planet. So I do want to recommend people check that out. And I'm just flabbergasted, Joe, that these critics, more so the militant critics, are still repeating this limestone argument over and over again, even though you and John have personally just absolutely dismantled that argument. So
yeah, there is more discussion to be had. It's not a one-stop solution kind of thing, but the issue we keep coming up over and over again is, there's no way that it can form in a flowing water environment. Like even the secular scientists are now considering flowing water environments, right? And then when let's actually go and look at the evidence, right? Yes, there are issues. Yes, there are problems that need to be considered and thought about, but so are there in every single secular interpretation. It's getting past that first bit. Okay, now let's see how this fits into a biblical worldview. So, yeah, it's good stuff. But let's have another question and see where we go.
Amen, brother. All right, here we go. So next question, and I'm just going to pick out the most questions that seem to be as relevant to the topic as possible. So how does this apply to flood boundaries, flood geology in general? Here's a common question that has been asked in all sorts of ways. So we'll ask it here in this specific way. How come we don't find animals such as sharks and marine mammals in the Cambrian layers?
Indeed. Or as Richard Dawkins said, he wanted to find rabbits in the Precambrian, I think. So,
exactly.
Well, this is actually a question which we will deal with a lot more thoroughly tomorrow, because where we're going tomorrow is the next step of, okay, let's look at how these rock layers actually form. Now, let me see if I can get up a PowerPoint slide very, very quickly. It's on here. We'll use this one from earlier, actually, just quickly as a point of reference. Let's try that one. There we go. And can you see that? Is that on full screen?
Yes, looks good.
Good stuff. Remember Steno's rock layer principle, right? And the way that it progressed. So you have the oldest rocks on the bottom and the youngest rocks on the top. And then you find, well, okay, ask the question, there's fish A, there's fish B. According to Steno's fossil principle, which fish was buried there first, fish A or fish B? The answer is, according to Steno's principle of superposition, it was fish B, right? The bottom layer got there first, the top layer got there last, therefore fish B got there first, fish A was buried last, therefore fish B is the oldest. And the way that secular geologists come to this is they come to this and they look at this principle. And if we go back a few slides, there we go. Whoops. You've got the bottom layer formed first and the top layer formed last. And so they say, well, the bottom layer...
Actually, Joe, I'm just going to interrupt you. I apologize, brother. It looks like currently what's on screen is just all of your slides. Like,
right, okay, 1 second. Let's change that then. Let's stop sharing. Stop screen. Let's, whoops, put this up to full screen. Then let's share that and see if that works. That's better. There we go. Is that better?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
That's good. Right, let's go back to here then and run through. So this is what we're looking at, right? Oldest rocks at the bottom, youngest rocks at the top, according to Steno's principle. Bottom rocks got there first, top rocks got there last. Then we have our fish A and fish B. According to the principles of superposition, Steno's fossil principles, which fish was buried first, fish A or B? And we said it was fish B, right? Bottom got there first, top got there last. Bottom layer is the oldest, top layer is the youngest. Therefore, fish B was fossilized first, fish A was fossilized last. And you skip forward through the logic and you get to Buffon and you get to Ray and Hooke and you get to Lyell and you get to Darwin, and all of a sudden you have a succession of the history of life. The bottom layer is the oldest, the top layer is the youngest. Therefore, the bottom layer represents the oldest life on Earth, the top layer represents the youngest life on Earth. Just like here. Trilobites and worms and ground-dwelling creatures on the bottom, moving up into the sort of the higher animals and the ammonites and the seashells, to the large marine creatures and the predatory fish, to the dinosaurs and the mammals and the humans on the top. According to Steno's principles, you can logically go through, as Lyell did, as Hutton did, as Darwin did, and say if the bottom got there first and the top got there last, you're looking at a history of life on Earth. Of course, John introduced a concept today, which we didn't get all the way through, right? Simply because we haven't been able to, but it said the bottom layer didn't get there first, the top layer didn't get there last. What we're actually looking at is a succession of rock layer formation, sedimentary formation, which is under flowing water. And this means, depending on the way the water is flowing and depending on the way that you're looking at it, right? In this case, as you look at this picture, the left-hand side got there first, the right-hand side got there last. And each one of these layers is not a representation of time, but it's a representation of a different current. It's a representation of a different speed of current, therefore carrying a different density of particle, therefore carrying a different size of sediment, therefore carrying, as you go, different types of creatures. And so what you're actually looking at is a rock record of forming left to right or right to left, depending on which way you're looking at it. It's water flowing sideways. The rock layers form sideways. All of our experiments show this. All of the real world observations from tides and deltas and the way that rock layers form in the real world shows this. And this is something we'll go into even more depth tomorrow, and we'll start comparing it to places like the Grand Canyon, right? Because the Grand Canyon is one of the best places on Earth to get the most complete geological record, and even that is missing hundreds of millions of years in some cases. I mean, I can take you down to the Cambrian and Ordovician rocks down at Aberystwyth Bay down in Pembrokeshire in Wales, and you're missing nearly 1 billion years worth of rock there. I mean, 1 billion years just gone. Interesting. What you're looking at here is a succession of left to right. So according to this new principle, which fossil got there first? Was it fossil A or fossil B? It was fossil A, because fossil A is the one closest to the way that the water would have come, flowing along, depositing the sediment. And within these layers, you would have had cross-bedding, and you'd have had chiastic flow, and you'd have had all these other principles which mingle in together. And sometimes you'll actually find, let's see if I can get a little pointer up here for you, because this is another point we'll be talking about tomorrow, right? You've got these layers, they're forming left to right, they're all forming at the same time, they're carrying different sediment, they're carrying different layers, but what you'll find is not only do you have cross-bedding going up through the layers like this, you actually have chiastic flow where the layers actually cross up through all of the layers at the same time. Because the way that even the plumber knows that water travels at different speeds depending on the friction and depending on the currents that it has, and that's why parts of your pipes erode quicker than other parts. And so you'll find you apply the same principle of water on a small scale to water on a large scale, and you'll find that the way that the rocks form over and over again, you've got a left to right principle. So your whole issue of, well, why don't you find fossils down here? Why do you find fossils up here? Is because you're still viewing at it from an evolutionary time scale, from the bottom being the oldest to the top being the youngest, and it simply doesn't work. You need to take a step back, get rid of Steno's principle. We're dealing with that tomorrow with the geological column, right? And have a completely new way of viewing the rocks, one that is actually based, well, forget about Noah's flood for a second, just based off of real world observations. And you'll find that what we observe in the real world far better fits a global flood catastrophe than millions of years of slow gradual deposition.
Again, another fantastic answer, Joe. I love that answer. And I think it's the perfect one to that common question and objection. I also look forward to tomorrow's presentation. Why don't we do one final question? And Joe, we'll let you get to bed. You've done such a great job here. So this one comes in from Cool Jesus. Cool Jesus, I appreciate your questions and also feedback on this important topic. So Cool Jesus asks, can you ask Joe to clarify? Do John and Joe believe that the entire geological column is fabricated? Is there any reliability about it at all?
Okay. Pull up one last slide to talk about, and then we'll finish on this one, I think. There we go. Here is your geological column, standard geological column as presented in textbooks, universities around the world, right? Bottom down there, you have the Cambrian. Top, you have the Quaternary. We're living in the Holocene, which is past the Pleistocene, right at the top, according to the geological column. Now, each one of these layers, if you like, each one of these eras, as they're now known as, were not originally interpreted as eras. They were originally based off of rock types shown correlations around the world. So if you go to the Ordovician, right, Ordovician is named after the Ordovici tribe. Why is it named after the Ordovici tribe? Well, they were a Celtic tribe that lived in sort of central to South Wales, and they no longer live there. They are now extinct completely. The Romans pretty much wiped them out, right? It's an extinct tribe. And when you go to this area where the Ordovici tribe lived during the Celtic times, you can dig up fossils of trilobites. John had one earlier. And as far as we can see, trilobites are extinct. So when the first geologists started digging up fossils, they named these rocks that you could find these extinct creatures in after the extinct tribe that used to live there, the Ordovici tribe. And so you have the Ordovician rocks. Now you can travel the world, as I've had the privilege of doing, and John has had the privilege of doing even more. You can go from the Ordovician rocks in Wales to the Ordovician rocks up in the top of the Lake District in the UK. You can fly over to America, to the States. You can go to Tennessee down by Carthage, and you can see the Ordovician limestone. And then you can fly over to Australia, and you can go down to the south, and you can have a look at the Ordovician limestone. Hey, it's all Ordovician. You go through the Ordovician shales and you find graptolites down in Victoria, state of Victoria in Australia. It's all the same rocks. And so they began to notice correlations, and they said, hey, all these correlations mean these must be Ordovician. They have all these correlations. They have all these same rock types. They have all these same chemical structures. These are the same deposit. Therefore, they're all Ordovician. Devonian, first named after, well, I wonder if you can guess that. Devonian, Devon in England, where you go and get your cream teas, right? Again, matched up around the world. Mississippian and Pennsylvanian, as I mentioned right at the beginning, that was an American naming system. We called them Carboniferous, Upper and Lower Carboniferous, because that's where we got our coal from, right? Full of coal, lots of coal here, lots of coal there. Must be the Carboniferous. Permian, named after Perm in Russia. Triassic, named because you've got 3 distinct layers of sandstone. Jurassic, named after the Jura Mountains. Cretaceous, named from the Latin name of chalk. You'll find that all of these so-called eras were actually categorized as rock groups. So you'll find me and John constantly using words like Cretaceous and Jurassic and so on and so forth, right? Cambrian, from the old Welsh name for the country, Cymru, right? You'll find all of these correlations. So the names are actually very, very useful. The descriptions of the rock type are very, very useful. And you'll see in our program tomorrow, one of the things I'm dealing with is following some of these deposits around the world, particularly the Carboniferous, right? Seeing the extent of it and matching it up to a global flood. All right, great stuff. So the names are very useful. The classifications are very useful. What about the way that they've been positioned in the geological record? I mean, is this really a true succession? Well, you remember Professor Age's comments from the beginning. Even at the Grand Canyon, there's masses of places, things missing. Even at the Grand Canyon, they're back to front. Even at the Grand Canyon, you cannot find a complete geological record. And I remember one of my first university professors of geology, which we went for a walk down along the Norfolk coast, fabulous geology, and he said, I hope you realize, students, that reading the book of the geological column is really like reading a book that's had its papers torn out and spread all across the world. And it's our job to go along and try and put the papers back together and try and make sense of a book without even knowing which order they go in, without having any page numbers, and not even knowing how many pages there are supposed to be. Right? It really is a mess. And then you get comments from the National Geographic which say illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film which has had 999 frames out of every 1,000 removed. I mean, 999 frames out of 1,000, you wouldn't have a lot of film left, right? And so you'll find that it's extremely spotty if you like, the geological column, the way that it's been put together, and extremely difficult to actually find a complete set off. The only way you can take all of these individual things and put them in this nice succession is if you accept two or three things. First of all, the principle of superposition from Dino, which is not backed up when you start to do the experiments of sedimentation. Number two, you accept the present is the key to the past, and so you've interpreted it through millions of years in the first place. And number three, you believe that the geology on Earth is a record of life on Earth over millions of years. And when you accept all of those three philosophies, because that's really all they are, and they're all based, as we dealt with the history, on old pagan philosophies, you can actually start to interpret them in the sense of the geological column. So the actual components of the geological column, yes, they were most of them founded by creationists like Alexander von Humboldt, who named the Jurassic because he traveled the world and he said, these are all the same rocks, just like the ones back home in the Jura Mountains. They must be the result of Noah's flood. And so the individual components are useful, but when you put them together, the only way you can put them together into the order of the geological column, as you see on the screen, is if you reject Genesis in the first place, base your philosophy off of old pagan ideas, and you accept the present is the key to the past, you interpret it through millions of years, and you have to admit, even after you do all of that, your geological column is still missing so many vital elements out of it.
Again, great answer, Indiana Joe. I'm telling you, with you and John Mackay, the creation guy, time flies by. We are at the 2 hour and 7 minute mark. So again, I want to thank you so much, brother, for the time and all of this amazing information. So I think we're going to wrap it up here on day one of our 2-day event, Flood Boundaries. So Indiana Joe, any final words, final thoughts, brother?
No, just join us tomorrow. We've got another big program, and say John will be able to hang around for a lot longer, so we'll be able to go through a lot more questions. We can do like a 3-hour stream or something like that. I'm more than happy with that. So yeah, it should be good. Join us tomorrow, because this is really, I've seen a lot of questions that have come through about lots of different, stuff about the Grand Canyon and all sorts of stuff, and we will cover that, or start to cover that, tomorrow with our program, and we're going to go into a lot more depth. We've just dealt with the history and kind of the basics of sedimentation today. We go into the specifics and the flood geology tomorrow. So join us there.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. Joe, it's late for you, so I'm going to let you get out of here, and I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes going over some reminders and updates for everybody, including a little bit of details on tomorrow's show as well, Joe. So again, thanks so much for doing this, and we look forward to tomorrow.
It's been great. Thank you all very much.
Okay. God bless. All right, guys, that wraps up day one of this heroic and epic, I like to say, 2-day event on flood boundaries. And I have to say, for all young Earth creationists, this is a must watch. So please make sure you're passing this content around, pass day one around, because the truth is so incredibly important. That's what we do here on this channel, is work at defending the truth of biblical creation. And today was incredibly thorough. I was very happy with how it turned out. We dealt with the geological column. We refuted compromise. Joe and John demonstrated irrefutably and undeniably, in my opinion, that young Earth creation is not a recent invention. We know some biblical compromisers out there, like Inspiring Philosophy, he's put out a video recently trying to say that young Earth creation is a Seventh-day Adventist invention. We dealt with that today. We dealt with the history of sedimentation and old Earth beliefs, the KT boundary. We went into an introduction into flood boundaries and the ordering of the fossil record. And all I got to say is deep time evolution is in big trouble. And this is an important and somewhat controversial topic. And I love to see just how many of you are so engaged in this important topic, and throwing in your questions. So for those who watch this for the first time tonight, or as we did this live, of course, it's going to be available as soon as I end the broadcast here. Think up some questions and bring them tomorrow. Make sure they apply to the topic, of course. And I'm really looking forward to day 2. So this was a ton of fun. 2+ hours really does fly by. And the creation research team, they're such a blessing. All of their relevant links are in the description box, guys. So please check that out. If you want to support them, that link is in the description box as well. That team is a bunch of warriors. I mean, they're doing fantastic work, fantastic research, and they truly are a blessing. As I like to say, it's 2022, and it's a great time to be a young Earth creationist. God bless everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.